Today's panel on Iraq is the second in a series of programs on Iraq that we have the privilege to sponsor, thanks to support from Shell. Our first panel we held in April looking at the U.S.-Iraqi relationship with Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman, Ambassador Faisal Istrabadi, and MEI scholar Daniel Surwer weighing in on the U.S.-Iraqi relationship. Coming up, we'll be looking at the energy sector in Iraq, domestic politics, and also the relationship between Iraq and its non-Arab neighbors, Turkey and Iran. So we'll keep you posted about those. And I want to thank especially Shell for making this event possible, and Tracy McMinn of Shell, who has facilitated all of this. It's really a great pleasure to be able to talk about Iraq at a time when there's very little attention paid to it. I also want to recognize a second person today who's been an advisor and mentor on Iraq, who's really helped me put together these panels I've been doing, as well as past panels on Iraq, and that is our moderator, Phoebe Marr, who's given me invaluable insights and I believe, made my programs much stronger and interesting. And if anyone in this room doesn't know Phoebe Marr, she is one of the foremost historians of modern Iraq who has researched and studied the country for decades. And she is the author of a classic textbook on Iraq entitled A Modern History of Iraq that's taught in hundreds of colleges in the United States and elsewhere, that has just been released in its third edition. So thank you, Phoebe, for all that you have done. Finally, we normally end exactly on the dot of, but today we've got 4 panelists, a fabulous program, and we may go a few minutes longer. I hope you will stay to enjoy the whole program. So now I'd like to turn it over to Phoebe. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for that very nice introduction, and I look forward to this session very much. I'm going to try to put in a couple of remarks and introduce our speakers who really don't need much introduction. As someone in the audience just reminded me, I really need to say this. There are going to be follow-on panels, particularly addressing Turkey and Iran. But today we're going to examine Iraq's relations with its Arab neighbors and, of course, vice versa. Let me try to put it in a little bit of context and then introduce the speakers who are the main attraction here. Iraq does occupy a very strategic and in some respects a unique geographic position in the Arab world. Many people see it as an eastern flank of the Arab world. It does border 2 large non-Arab neighbors and 4 different Arab countries. And those Arab countries, Syria, and have different orientations. Syria, Jordan, we can even throw in Lebanon, which doesn't border Iraq, face the Mediterranean and toward the west. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and of course the rest of the GCC are Gulf powers facing the Indian Ocean. And as we all know, ad infinitum, Iraq contains a diverse population, an Arabic-speaking majority, with very strong ties to the Arab world, a Shia majority with strong cultural, religious ties to Iran, a Turkish minority with ties across the border in Turkey, Iran, and also Syria, an Arab country. And throughout its history, Iraq has had difficulty in managing this complex set of relations with its neighbors, with plenty of opportunity for not only good cross-cultural ties, but neighbors' influence inside Iraq. As we all know, 2003 has brought new groups to power in Iraq with new orientations and closer relations with Iran and Turkey. And this is causing considerable angst in Arab countries, now themselves in the throes of a political transition, and complicating Iraq's relations with its Arab neighbors. I think 2 other strategic factors shape Iraq policy toward Arab neighbors. Iraq is and feels almost a landlocked power. With oil, it has to get out through the Gulf. But little Gulf shoreline, limited in its control on one side by Iran and by Kuwait on the other. This has made for difficult relations with both powers. And of course, as we know, Iraq is an oil power, now developing its oil, which needs to get to market, either through the Gulf or its neighbors. Iraq itself has gone through a political upheaval, a revolutionary political change, and the occupation, as we know, has more or less destroyed the underpinnings of the former regime, possibly even the state. Although Iraq is slowly reviving, the process is bumpy. Iraq still is a weak state, difficult even for it to control its borders, much less project power across its borders. Under these circumstances, what role can Iraq play in the region? What role does it seek to play, particularly with its Arab neighbors? Now the region itself, as we know, is shifting as it goes into, I believe, a long political transition. The strategic balance in the whole region may be changing in unpredictable ways. Many moving pieces out there. This will provide difficulties for Iraq, but also possible opportunities. Iraq's oil production is increasing. The economy is doing better. There are bitter political disputes inside Iraq, but they are being settled politically. What impact is this current Arab transformation, especially in Syria, likely to have in Iraq? In thinking about some key questions that our speakers, I hope, will address, along with others, what role for Iraq in a volatile but changing Arab region, particularly with respect to its key neighbors? What role for the U.S. In helping Iraq have better relations with the Arab neighbors as it draws its infrastructure down in Iraq? And how about the Gulf, especially Saudi Arabia and Kuwait? We have seen somewhat better relations with these two powers recently. Will it continue? What factors could encourage improvement? And how is increasing Iraqi oil production going to play in all of this? And last but not least, what about Syria, now a wild card? Iraq seems to have ambivalent attitudes towards Syria, few good options, not only for Iraq, but most others. And how will the Kurdish factor play in? Today we have 4 absolutely stellar speakers to address these issues and others they may see as relevant. And I'm going to just say a few words of introduction and then let them take over. We're going to start with Ambassador Samir Sumedai on Iraq. As you all know, he has been the face of Iraq in Washington, ambassador from 2006 until, I think it was this year, if I'm not mistaken. Before that, he was Iraq's representative to the UN and on the initial governing council and a minister of interior in Iraq. And I have found him a very, very insightful analyst in looking at Iraq's domestic politics and, of course, its foreign policy. We're going to follow with Greg Gause on the Gulf, essentially. As you probably know, Greg is professor of political science at the University of Vermont and has spent numerous trips to the Middle East and the Gulf. Among other things, he has just put out a really excellent book, which I recommend, International Relations of the Persian Gulf. Next will be Ken Pollack, whom I think everyone in this community knows, now a senior fellow at the Saban Center, an expert on national security and military affairs, was director of Persian Gulf Affairs in the 90s when we worked together on this policy toward Iraq, really knows Iraq and its security side. And we're going to end up with John DeRocha, who will address the U.S. Role in all of this. He is now director of the Office of Iraq Affairs in the State Department. He spent 2009 at the embassy in Baghdad as an economic counselor and has had a lot of experience in other Arab countries, particularly in economics. Now, I'm going to ask the speakers to try to limit their remarks to about 12 to 15 minutes. That's going to be very difficult. And I will try to follow with a few minutes of repartee if anyone wants to respond. And then, of course, we'll take questions from the audience. So without further ado, let me introduce Ambassador Samira Samadai.
Thank you, Phoebe, for whatever you like. You are the boss.
As you like. Which would be? Yeah, I think.
Right. Okay.
I think it's better.
Thank you, Phoebe, for this excellent introduction, and I'd like to thank the Middle East Institute for organizing this. Phoebe highlighted practically all the hot-button issues that should be discussed. I normally like to be the last of the speakers, but they pushed me to be the first, so here we go. First, let me make it clear that I don't speak for Iraq. Now, I'm not the ambassador of Iraq. I'm a free agent. Of course, I was an active participant for a very long time in the Iraqi politics and the making of the new Iraq, and always a keen observer. But I speak strictly as a private citizen of Iraq. I thought what would be the best approach to address this obviously well-informed audience. The best thing is really to set out the context for the subject of this discussion. Understanding Iraq has to be bracketed by three major factors. Iraq's own history, political, social, cultural, and so on. The external influences which for millennia have been bearing down upon it. And third, and most important, and very important, is oil. These three factors interplay, and if we understand how they interplay, we begin to understand the Iraqi situation. Let's look at the context of history in three stages. The stage prior to the American intervention, during the intervention, and post-American military intervention. During the previous era, that's the era before American intervention, since the formation of the state of Iraq, it was with the British intervention at that, British military intervention, as you all know, Iraq was making really very good progress, and its social, economic, and political development were making considerable strides to build a modern nation. The wrong turning was taken, military coup d'etat, 1958, and that descended into the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein and the catastrophes of wars that he brought upon the country. During that period, practically every indicator went backwards. All social, economic, and cultural indicators, education, health service, everything went backwards. As a result, we ended up at the end, just prior to the intervention, especially when also the sanctions were put on top of all these negative influences, we ended up with a broken Iraq just before the Americans moved in. Broken in every sense, and practically backward in every sense. When the Americans came in, the fissures were dramatically apparent. Then we come to the Americans and their role in Iraq. What did they do with this broken country? Many books have been written, and historians, no doubt, will continue to debate and argue about the American role in Iraq for many years to come. But I think it is now a general consensus that some decisions were made inappropriately, or the wrong decisions were made in the early stages of the intervention, which have left their mark on the post-American period. There were structural issues that were influenced by the Americans, which have left us with an Iraq now that is more difficult to manage than otherwise would have been the case. Let me just make a few comments about the sectarian conflict in Iraq. Everybody talks about sectarianism in Iraq, and sectarianism is there and was always there. But Iraq is not Northern Ireland. Iraq's sectarianism is fluid and malleable. It has always been. There is a lot of intermarriage between families. The two communities are not traditionally hostile. But of course, during Saddam's time, with his sectarian policies, he made this issue a much more destructive issue, much more negative issue. But in my opinion, we were capable of recovering from Saddam's time had the right approach been taken by the Americans afterwards. I speak from direct experience and from many arguments I had at the time with the CPA, in particular with Ambassador Bremer. The American attitude at the beginning was, we have to satisfy the Islamist parties. Otherwise, we will have trouble on our hands. People like me argued that, no, this is not the time to do that. It is time to strengthen the secular forces, because Iraq's emancipation, Iraq's progress has to be tied to secular forces. Without a secular political system, Iraq is sunk. It was not to be. And the result was early elections, perhaps earlier than should have been, and a major role for the Islamist parties, whether Sunni or Shi'i. Islamist parties, by definition, are sectarian. And this has, if you like, determined or predetermined the foundations of the political system that exists. We have a kind of dichotomy. We have a constitution which, on the one hand, says it forbids discrimination on the basis of sect, religion, race, ethnicity, gender, and everything. It's very clear. It's in black and white. Yet, the political system of Iraq right now is based on the assumption that the prime minister should be a Shia, the president has been a Kurd, and there is a kind of Lebanization of the system, which is not really consistent with the constitution. And this has to be resolved one way or another, but for the time being, there is no way of resolving it. Now we come back to the subject of the discussion, the Arab relations. The Arabs themselves took a very negative attitude towards the intervention by the Americans in Iraq. And for a long time, they stayed away and kept their distance. Contrast the position of Iran. When we were in the Governing Council, the first high-level delegation we had from anybody was from the Iranians. The Americans made valiant efforts to persuade our Arab neighbors to engage, to support, but they were always kept their distance, and they did not really respond. There was lip service being played about the role of Iraq and the importance of Iraq, but really no real significant engagement. And the reason for that, there are many reasons. One is the horror with which some of them viewed this transition in Iraq and the ascendancy of the Shia parties. And the other is the suspicion of this democracy which is come, and what is it going to do to us? So the combination of all these factors meant that that the Arabs held a very suspicious and standoffish position. Iraq, on the other hand, while trying to engage with Arab countries, had its hands full with its own internal conflicts. It made overtures, and the overtures in many cases were repelled. The most recent Arab summit was, I would say, a very modest success. If we judge it by the level of participation, the duration, and the whole period of preparation and aftermath, it was a grudging acknowledgement that Iraq has to be a member of the club, but we don't like it. That's the feeling generated. And Iraq, as a government, I think played their hands quite well by moderating their language, by being extra friendly. They made an effort, but the internal political issues were uppermost in people's mind. I'm speaking on the Arab side. Where do we go? What's the situation now? The situation is that Iraq itself has so many structural, political, and other issues to deal with that it is in a crisis, and it's working hard to find a way out of the crisis, and the horizon seems to be more of the same. I liken it with a creaking boat, which is possibly taking in water in the midst of storms raging around it. There are huge storms going through the region. There is, at the geopolitical level, a confrontation between the West and Iran on the one hand, and there is an alliance with the West within the region. There is Syria, which is burning and might overspill in Iraq, and yet we are within the country not in a sound situation. The best way for Iraq to move forward would be to improve internal cohesion, to resolve the political crisis that exists, to mend fences with Kuwait, and perhaps reduce the language of quarrel with Turkey, to avoid being seen as a sphere of influence by Iran, but keep a working positive relationship with Iran because we have to, and at a minimum to be neutral vis-a-vis Syria, to avoid the situation if the Syrian, or I should correct myself, when the Syrian regime collapses, so Iraq should not be paying a price. And throughout this, stay close to the United States, continue to build a strategic alliance with the United States. That's where the future of Iraq lies, and with this, I close. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Samir. And Greg, can I ask you to step up to the podium?
You both may ask me and can ask me.
Oh, you're right
to
there.
do that.
Sorry.
It's a great pleasure to come down from Vermont in the middle of July to the nation's capital, but at least it wasn't last week. No, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks very much to MEI, and it's an honor to join this very distinguished panel. There's certainly different points of view within the Gulf Cooperation Council states on relations with Iraq. And I think that Phoebe pointed out that maybe the most interesting thing in the last couple of months has been Kuwait. And we could spend, I could spend my whole 10 minutes talking about Kuwait, which is a fascinating place. But I think that during times of crisis, and we're in a crisis, as the ambassador mentioned, the GCC states tend to close ranks on important issues. You can tell when their threat perception is low because that's when they fight amongst each other and have very different approaches to international relations. And you can tell when they think that the level of threat is pretty high because then they tend to close ranks. And I think that that's where we are now. So there are not that many differences right now among the GCC states on their approach to Iraq, and that approach is basically led by Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis take the lead on Iraqi issues within the GCC. And the Saudi view of Iraq, in my judgment, if the ambassador doesn't speak for Iraq, I certainly do not speak for Saudi Arabia. This is just my analysis of it. They have an embassy down there if you want to ask them what their official position is. My view is that their view of the Maliki government and of Iraq is extremely negative. They, in essence, view Prime Minister al-Maliki as an agent of Iran and will refuse to deal with him in any substantive way. The Saudis, of course, backed Iyad Allawi very strongly in the elections of 2005, 2010. They wonder about democracy, because Allawi did get the most seats in the last election, yet he didn't become prime minister. That's kind of a joke. The Saudis obviously have contacts across the board in Iraqi politics. This is the way they play politics everywhere. With tribal figures, with local political leaders, maybe even with people who blow things up every once in a while. But I actually see Saudi policy on Iraq as pretty passive. There's no real outreach to the Kurds, who are, of course, a major player in Iraqi politics. I don't really see any serious Saudi outreach to either the president of Iraq or to Mr. Barzani. I see the Saudis engaged in no serious effort to play within the politics of the Shia community within Iraq, even though that community is divided on all sorts of political lines, and there is the possibility to do that. I mean, the fact that Muqtada al-Sadr was in Kuwait just a few months ago is a very interesting thing. I think if the Saudis were more aggressive or more active in terms of efforts to influence the direction of Iraqi politics, they might have a little bit of outreach to Sadr, despite all of the obstacles one can imagine to that. I don't see that happening. The Saudis have made no real appeal to Arabism in their outreach to Iraq. I'll speak in a moment about the sectarian issue in the framing of Saudi foreign policy here. But they have, I think, an alternative platform that they could reach out to Iraqis across sectarian lines, not across ethnic lines, but across sectarian lines. And that is, we're all Arabs. These other guys aren't, right? We know who the other guys are. These other guys aren't Arabs. We're all Arabs. But they don't do that. That's not the way that they've phrased their policy. It seems to me that this is a very passive policy. Policy of complaint, not particularly a policy of outreach, and not a particularly creative policy. A policy that has some very loud no's, but very few yeses in it. So why this passivity toward Iraq? given how important Iraq is? Well, partially, of course, these days, there's only so many issues that the regime can handle in terms of foreign policy because it's a very closed-knit decision-making process. It doesn't have a wide-ranging, very professionalized foreign policy establishment. And when Syria is everybody's top focus, everything else kind of falls off. But I think that it's more than this. And I think that the suspicion, and not unreasonably, is that Saudi policy is driven entirely by sectarianism. That it's Sunnis and Shias, and that's the way they view the world, and that is the only thing that matters. I think that's wrong. I think the sectarian issue is extremely important here, but I think we have to put it in context, and that's the last thing I want to do. I think the elite view in Saudi Arabia of regional politics is geopolitical, not sectarian. I think that they are engaged in a struggle for influence within the Middle East with Iran. I think that around 2006, 2007, they decided that Iran could not be, the current iteration of the Iranian government could not be accommodated, and they could not have an understanding with it. And from that time, they focused their foreign policy on trying to contain and, if possible, roll back Iranian influence in the Arab world. In that, they have failed. They failed in Iraq. They failed in Lebanon. They failed in Palestine. And I think that they feel that failure very strongly. This contest for influence with Iran is played out not through armies on battlefields, right, but through the contest for influence in the politics, in the domestic politics of weak Arab states. Right? In that contest for influence, naturally the Saudis find Sunni allies and the Iranians find Shi'i allies. That's not 100% accurate. There's not many Shia in Hamas, right? But it's largely the way the political map breaks out in these places where the Iranians and the Saudis are contesting for influence. And we could even look outside the Arab world into Pakistan and other places. Here. Thus, that sectarian mapping, right, which is so acute in the politics of Syria, of Lebanon, of Iraq, is the way that the Saudis conduct their contest for influence with Iran these days. This sectarian card is particularly useful in Syria, given the demographics of Syria. The Saudis have played it very, very strongly. Right? They see Bahrain in those terms as well. Right? Bahrain is both a geopolitical threat to them, where they see the Shia majority in Bahrain as being allied either implicitly or explicitly with Iran. And Bahrain is also a domestic political security issue, as we've seen in the last few days. And if you looked at the YouTubes of the funeral parades of the two Saudi Shia who were killed after Nimr al-Nimr was arrested, you see Bahraini flags in those funeral parades, along with mourning flags and other things. You see Bahraini flags, right? So for the Saudis, right, Bahrain is not just a geopolitical issue, it's a domestic security issue. But I think when we go out to Iraq, to Syria, to Lebanon, it's more geopolitical. But the instrument with which they play is the mobilization of Sunni political allies. The Saudi media and the pan-Arab media that's mostly owned by Saudis has thus also played this sectarian, has portrayed these conflicts as sectarian and played to Sunni majoritarian status in Syria particularly, right, as part of their conflict to try to roll back Iranian influence there. But, and this is my last point, this is a dangerous game. Right? This is a dangerous game. This sectarianization of the presentation of Saudi foreign policy and the conduct of Saudi foreign policy in these last few years drives Arab Shia toward Iran. It gives them no option, whether it be in Iraq or Bahrain. It also creates an atmosphere in which al-Qaeda type ideas, if not al-Qaeda as an organization itself, can flourish. And that's a long-term problem, geopolitically and domestically for Saudi Arabia, and a longer-term problem for American interests in the region as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. We're doing very well on time. And can I ask Ken? Good. All right. They're all obeying very well.
Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, MEI. It's a pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to be here with my three wonderful colleagues, Samir, John, Greg, all three of whom I have enormous respect for, but especially for you, Phoebe, the doyenne of Iraq studies in America, the person who, if you're an Iraq expert in America, you are a student of Phoebe Mars, whether you've taken her classes or not. So, Phoebe, it's great to be here with you. Samir and Greg's presentations were terrific as segues and building blocks for the issue that Kate asked me to talk about, which is Iraq's foreign policy towards Syria. And I think it's a great topic because in and of itself it's extremely important. As Greg already pointed out, Syria is the hot thing in the Middle East. And the Middle East is pretty hot right now, both literally and figuratively. And Syria is the flame that is burning brightest. But also because I actually think that looking at Iraqi policy towards Syria is in many ways the best way to understand where Iraqi foreign policy is right now. And the first thing that I would say about it is that if you are going to start talking about Iraqi policy towards Syria, you can't talk about what is Iraq's policy towards Syria. You have to talk about what are the different Iraqi policies towards Syria. Because in Iraq, where you stand is where you sit. And as Samir started to lay out, and as Greg started to lay out, there are multiple policies toward Syria from different groups, different factions within Iraq. And again, this is a very common phenomena. I was actually thinking that, Greg's book on the international relations of the region is superb. But if I had to recommend only one book right now, the book I would actually recommend is Machiavelli's Florentine Histories. You want to understand the geopolitics of the Middle East today? Read the Florentine Histories. Because what comes through the theme of Machiavelli's Florentine Histories is the complex interplay of internal factionalization within weak states and their external relations, and how these are all mixed up together. And so Florence and Pisa and Milan and Rome were all constantly playing off against each other and playing off against the different factions within each city. And different factions would ally with different cities or different factions in other cities. That's the Middle East today. And when you look at Iraq, that is very much its foreign policy. And nowhere does this come out stronger than with regard to Iraqi policy towards Syria. I thought I'd just kind of go around the horn. And by the way, my remarks today are informed by a series of conversations that I've had in the last 2 months, both in Erbil and in Baghdad. I've gotten to speak to pretty much the entire Iraqi senior leadership, with the exception of Muqtada as-Sadr. But I have a pretty good sense of where he is, so I'm going to ad-lib him, but I don't think I'm doing too much damage. I wanted to start actually with the Kurds. I was thinking of starting with the Iraqi government, but in many ways, it's actually best to come back to the government and do them last. For the Kurds, what is going on in Syria seems much more like an opportunity than a threat. And when you talk to the Kurdish leadership, what you hear from them is very much the sense that, yes, what's going on in Syria is horrible, it's terrible, it's bad for the Syrian people, could spill over into Iraq. Wouldn't that be awful? But it does create some interesting opportunities for us. And we have seen Masoud Barzani reaching out to Ankara and trying to cement the relationship that he has built with Ankara over the years, using Syria in part as one of the tools to do so. And it is not an accident that the Kurds are trying to work very closely with the Turks on what is happening in Syria, working with them to try to make inroads into the Syrian Kurdish populations, trying to reassure the Turks that Iraqi Kurdish interests in Syria are the same as Turkish interests in Syria. Because increasingly, the Kurds, and particularly here Barzani's faction, are at odds with the central government and are increasingly thinking about the possibility of independence once again, and doing so in much more concrete terms than I have ever heard the Kurds do, and I've been dealing with the Kurds for over 20 years. Okay? And so they look at the Syrian civil war as something that potentially could create chaos in Iraq, which could be bad or it could be good, because it could create the circumstances for the Kurds to declare independence. And they look at Turkey's fear of what is going on in Syria as another way of potentially binding themselves to the Turks, who they increasingly see as their real partner for the future. Their economic partner, their political partner, their diplomatic partner, their security partner. Okay, the country that could make independence for Iraqi Kurdistan a reality. And even if they don't go all the way down that road, even if it is just some enhanced form of autonomy, again, they see Turkey as critical because they believe that the Turks share their interests and are willing to push back on Baghdad, on the government, on the Maliki regime in Baghdad, and enable them to distance themselves from Baghdad and potentially even break away from Iraq. Moving to the southwest, obviously the Sunni tribes, the Sunni tribal leadership, the larger Sunni community of Anbar, of Salahuddin, of Nineveh, they're all over the map, and you can get almost any opinion from any Sunni sheikh, depending on who you speak to and what time of day it is and who they saw last. Okay. But the fact is that there is a very significant element within that community that also looks at what is going on in Syria as being as much an opportunity as it is a threat. They too look across the border, and what they see is the Sunni population of Syria finally standing up and throwing off the yoke of a nasty Iranian-backed Shia regime. Okay? And what they say is, hey, we've got the same problem, only it's in Baghdad, not in Damascus. Okay. And what you hear from them is that the Saudis, and I think Greg is absolutely right, most of their policy has been passive, but there is an increasing flow of money, of weapons, of jihadists coming out of Saudi Arabia and into Iraq, ultimately destined for Syria. But, it's the Middle East, and, you always skim a little bit off the top. You take some of the money, you take some of the weapons, you take some of the jihadists. Okay. And I don't think that it is coincidental that we have seen an increase in violence, an increase in Sunni terrorist attacks over the last 2-3 months, at the same time that we are starting to see this greater flow. And again, when you talk to Sunni tribal sheikhs, they all say this is what's happening. And when you talk to Saudis, some of them, in their unguarded moments, will say as much as well. And in fact, a Saudi I spoke to a number of months ago said to me pretty much exactly the words that I just used to you, which is, he said, look, when we look at Iraq and Syria, we see Sunni tribes, the same Sunni tribes, being oppressed by a pair of nasty Iranian-backed Shia regime. And we are now going to aid those Sunni tribes. Okay? And we expect them to use that aid against both of these different problems. Okay? And so again, for many of these Sunni tribes who see as their principal adversary the Shia-dominated, the Shia-majority regime in Baghdad, this aid from Saudi Arabia and whatever aid they can secure from Syria. And remember, the Syrian desert is one big place. You've got Shamara on both sides. You've got Dulaim on both sides. All these tribes span the border, and the border is just a line on a map. It doesn't exist out there in the desert. Okay? And so it's easy for these things to slop back and forth across the border. Okay. And yes, right now, the flow of foreign fighters, I think, is moving more in the direction of from Iraq into Syria, but inevitably there will be movement back across the border as Syrians come into Iraq to rest, to find sanctuary, to rebuild, to train, and some of those will start to be used by Iraqis for Iraqi operations as well. For the Sadrs, for the other Shia opposition to the government, again, it's somewhat harder. I think that they are wary of what's going on in Syria because it is a sectarian war. And while on the one hand, they have some sympathy for the opposition, on the other hand, they have sympathy for the regime as well. And I think they find it hard to quite figure out exactly where things are, and it's why you find when you talk to them, they're often on two different sides of the issue. But again, what typically determines, my experience speaking to them, is that what typically determines what side of the fence they're leaning toward on any given day is really how they feel about Baghdad. and where they are in terms of their relationship with the government, and to a lesser extent, but not much of a lesser extent, where they stand in their relations with Iran. Okay, which also obviously has a very big stake in what's going on in Syria and is trying to push them to support the government in its Syria policy. Which brings me to the government itself. And here we have to be very careful. Because let's remember, one of the strange things about Iraq is that the Iraqi opposition is part of the government. Okay? Iraqiyya, the Kurds, particularly Barzani's KDP, and the Sadrists are all key components of the government itself. But when I speak of the government, what I really am referring to is Prime Minister Maliki's State of Law coalition, and then all of the independents that he has built up around him, and even the factions of these other groups that he has more or less managed to pry away. So there's factions of Iraqiyya he's been able to pull away. Some of the Kurdish groups are much more deeply aligned with him than they are necessarily with Barzani, or they switch back and forth, and also among the Sadrists as well. And there what you find is that they are very much betwixt and between. And it goes back very much to remarks that both Samir and Greg made, which is on the one hand, this is a government that is very fearful of what is going on in Syria. They see the civil war in Syria, they see it spilling over into Iraq, and they are very frightened. The instability of Syria is going to trigger worsening instability in Iraq. They see the violence worsening, they are frightened of it, and they are talking. You've now had Hoshar Zebari make multiple comments over the last few months saying the spillover from Syria is affecting Iraqi stability, is affecting Iraqi security, and it could get worse over time. In addition, as Greg pointed out, this is a government that has no particular love for Iran, and I'd say that in particular about Prime Minister Maliki and the people around him, but doesn't feel like it has anywhere else to turn to. They feel like they have been rejected by the Sunnis, particularly by Saudi Arabia, and they are not blameless in that. Okay, the government mishandled its relationship with Saudi Arabia just as much as the Saudis mishandled their relationship with Iraq. Both sides share blame for that, but the reality is a very simple one, which is that the Iraqis feel very much, the government feels very much estranged from the Sunni world. And the Sunni world is not showing it any love, and they don't feel like there's anyone that they have left to turn to except the Iranians. And let's face facts, the Iranians do exert a lot of influence inside of Iraq these days. And how much the vote of no confidence that's been in the works, been threatened for months now, how much that has been turned off by the Prime Minister's own very clever political efforts, and how much by Iranian pressure on the PUK and on the Sadrists, we may never know. But it's clear that both of those things are at work. And the government, much as it may dislike the Iranians, is very dependent on the Iranians and very wary of the Iranians and very desirous of not offending the Iranians. Okay. And as a result, what you see before you is, as I said, multiple Iraqi foreign policies when it comes to Syria. And those foreign policies are driven principally by Iraq's own internal politics and the relationships that each of Iraq's internal factions is seeking to develop with different external forces, external governments or factions within other countries around the Middle East. And it's what makes Iraqi politics towards Syria so complex, so difficult to predict, but also in many ways so emblematic of the larger foreign policy problems facing Iraq. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ken. And now to finish up, John DeRocha. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's terrific to be here this afternoon, particularly with this really impressive panel. And I don't know if this is why Ambassador Sumedai likes to go last, but the fact is things have been covered so thoroughly. I think a fair bit of work has been done for me, which I'm perfectly happy with. So I will try to keep it brief and just give you a little bit of perspective on U.S. government view on Iraq and its relations with its Arab neighbors. When then Assistant Secretary Feltman was here back in April, I think it was, for the first of these presentations, he noted then that it was an exciting time to be working on Middle East issues and an exciting time to be working on Iraq issues. I've had my share of that excitement. As Phoebe noted, one of my earliest assignments with the Foreign Service was as desk officer for Iraq in the mid-1990s, which is when I first met Phoebe. And then I did a bit of other Middle East work, but I was at our embassy in Baghdad in 2009 and have been doing my current job since then. When I was first on the Iraq desk 15 years ago or so, I was one of two desk officers for Iraq in the Middle East Bureau at the State Department. Things have changed a bit. I realize that Iraq is not in the news today, say the way it was a year or a few years ago, but it is still certainly of great interest to an awful lot of people, and as shown by the turnout today. But there's a lot more than two Iraq desk officers these days. When I was a desk officer working on this 15 years ago, my job basically, Iraq was a pariah state under Saddam, and my job was to try to compel Saddam's compliance with UN resolutions through economic sanctions and through diplomatic isolation. My current job is to try to promote our U.S. national interests by building a partnership with Iraq, and I have to say I find this new responsibility much more rewarding than the earlier my earlier iteration in this kind of work. Let me just start by noting that the path on which the United States and Iraq have been traveling has certainly not been an easy one, but we are now building a mutually beneficial relationship with one of the most important countries in the Arab world, given its enormous population, its proud cultural, educational history, its abundant national resources. Of course, it's very much in America's interest to support a democratic, secure, and sovereign Iraq. And we're focused on building that relationship that supports Iraq's emergence as a partner of the United States and a force for stability and moderation in a very strategic region. And part of this partnership, from our perspective, is to help Iraq build its relations with its neighbors and with the broader world. And that's one of the focuses of our strategic framework agreement that we signed in 2008. It's the focus of our one of our joint coordinating committees under that framework. Foreign Minister Zabari and Secretary Clinton last sat down for a full meeting of that committee at the end of last year. And our objective is to work with the Iraqis to help boost their relations with their neighbors and more broadly, and help it play a positive and constructive role. We also urge Iraq's neighbors in the region to deal directly and positively with Iraq's leaders, despite Iraq's own internal challenges. And I think the trend in a lot of places is very positive, and I won't dwell on this. I'll try not to dwell on this because I do think this is where some of my colleagues have already fleshed things out a bit. So I'll try not to spend too much time on this. But it is worth noting that Iraq and Kuwait have made considerable progress towards settling a number of longstanding disputes that go back to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 on things like missing persons and missing archives and their Kuwait Airways disagreement and demarcating the border and so on. Iraq's relationships with Jordan have grown somewhat recently. It's participated in some exercises there, and they're looking to do more economic and energy cooperation. Saudi Arabia named an ambassador to Iraq for the first time since 1990. Qatar Airways has recently reopened its flights back to Iraq. Ambassador Sumadai talked a bit about the Arab League summit in Baghdad. He described it as a modest accomplishment. Respectfully, I don't think a modest accomplishment is a bad thing given recent history, and I think it's a very positive. I think it's a very positive event. These are small things, but to us they're significant, and the trend is good. Ken talked a lot about Syria. Let me just talk a little bit about Syria. And, of course, that's one of the relationships that's much more challenging. U.S. policy, of course, is very clear. Assad has to go so that a democratic transition can move forward, and the longer he is there, the greater the danger to the Syrian people, to the region, and to the region writ large. I think, Ken noted that a lot of the concern in Iraq with the situation in Syria is driven by a concern that a sudden collapse in Syria could have a spillover effect in Iraq that would be very dangerous and might lead to a successor regime that might be very hostile to Iraq. And we recognize that how much of a factor that is for Iraqis. Pardon me. At the same time, we encourage Iraq to support the Arab League consensus on Syria. Iraq has increasingly moved in that direction. Prime Minister Maliki has said publicly that the dictatorship must end and that the days of one-party rule in Syria are gone. And we will continue to urge Baghdad to call for Assad's immediate departure and to support the Special Envoy Kofi Annan's plan and the relevant Security Council resolutions. But I want to close by noting something from our perspective that I think Ambassador Sumadai alluded to also sort of at the end of his remarks. And I've laid out a couple of factors and a couple of recent elements on specific countries, specific Arab neighbors in Iraq and events that have taken place. But I think from our perspective, a key or maybe the key to Iraq being able to build its relations to neighbors in the region has less to do with a disagreement or a dispute with this neighbor or that neighbor, but more it lies within Iraq and not outside Iraq. What Iraq really needs to do is address its own internal political divisions. The divisions among Iraq's political blocs and even sometimes within those blocs have really, as we know, led to a real problem with enduring political tension and gridlock. The government is really stuck over issues related to power sharing among the blocs and among Iraq's major sects. And this has sort of compelled Iraq's leaders to be very inward-looking and be focused on their internal disputes and not on a lot of the day-to-day business of government or its relationship with the wider world. And that's very unfortunate. We of course want to see Iraq move forward. We certainly, in a situation like Iraq's, a certain amount of tension is inevitable and understandable, but we don't think that gridlock has to be. Like I said, it's leaving an awful lot of issues neglected. There are a lot of things within Iraq that the government has to deal with, challenges about security and the economy, infrastructure, basic services, and so on. And it's important that Iraq's leaders and Iraq's parliament work to move forward with necessary legislation and other steps to address some of these problems. And then Iraq will be better positioned when it is better positioned at home. It will be in better condition to deal successfully with all of its neighbors. When Assistant Secretary Feltman was here back in April, he noted that our engagement in Iraq is founded on a sense of partnership and shared interests. We share an elemental goal, a united and self-reliant and democratic, prosperous Iraq that is well integrated in the region, serves the needs of its people. Iraq's history certainly recently has been full of challenges, and it's easy. The very obvious narrative is to focus on the ill-conceived wars and the humanitarian disasters of the previous regime, and the violence that has characterized so much of the last decade. And it's easy to be overwhelmed by this history, but it's notable how much Iraqis have not been, and Iraqis have been very resilient and really tried to push forward. We think that's very impressive. We think the progress Iraq has made so far from a pariah state to one that is more stable and more prosperous and on better terms with its neighbors is something that's really admirable. I think the most poignant of that example of that is Kuwait. Of course, we don't need to review the horrors of 1990. Everybody is really quite aware. But when you look at how far Iraq has come in its relations with Kuwait recently, I think it bodes very well, and it's a cause for hope. So I think, yes, a lot of what I wanted to say has already been covered, I think, pretty effectively, and I know we want to have time for questions. So let me thank everyone again and thank my fellow panelists and turn it back over to Phoebe.
Excellent, especially for a short period of time. Very, very rich discussion. I'm going to allow the panelists to address one another. I have a couple of points I'd like to throw in on this to get a little discussion started, maybe about 5 minutes, panelists, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions from this very, very good audience. And I think the main problem we're going to have is time. It strikes me, Greg, I think this would be directed to you, although John DeRocha did say a few words about it. How is Iraq doing on Kuwait? What I heard from some other people was that much of the GCC really didn't take the same hard line toward Iraq as Saudi Arabia, and possibly even the Mubarak port might be stalled a bit. But I wonder if you could just add a word on how Iraq is doing with Kuwait. And in this response, it strikes me that we have an interesting. Everybody has discussed all politics is domestic, especially in Iraq, and Ken has raised this whole issue of which I think is critical of Iraqi identity. And I wonder, Samir, if you would like to address that issue and maybe get a little discussion going on how cohesive Iraq is. Is there one foreign policy and so on. And I think another issue that we might bring up, John, on the U.S. side, is given the withdrawal and the drawdown and our whole budget issues, speaking of gridlock, how much leverage, both positive and negative, do you think we have in, say, influencing Iraq and possibly its neighbors like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia? But I'd like to open it up also for the panel if anyone wants to address not only these issues but others you see as important. Anybody want to join in on that?
I mean, very briefly on Kuwait, I think that the biggest problem that the Kuwaitis will have is the rising political force in Kuwait tends to be Sunni, tribal, and somewhat Salafi, and affected in their foreign policy views to the extent that they have them by the Saudi view of these things. And I think that for a Kuwaiti government to move on the big ticket items on Iraq, it will run into parliamentary opposition, and it has in the past on these issues. And by big ticket, getting Iraq out of Chapter 7 and all that kind of stuff. It's a highly symbolic issue with which the parliament beats the government. Now, parliament has been prorogued, and we don't know what the situation in Kuwait is going to be. If parliament is out of the picture for some time, it might give the Kuwaiti government a little space to actually move on these issues. But I think that depends a lot on Kuwaiti domestic politics.
Yeah, Samir.
I'd like to go back to an excellent comment made by Ken about the Florentine histories. Weak states have a complex relationship with each other. And actually, that takes me back to the state of the Middle East in the Middle Ages, when there were a lot of small states paying some allegiance, token allegiance, to the Caliphate in Baghdad, but actually engaged in a struggle between them. And the main impression you get is fragmentation. When the states are weak, they fragment in many different ways, but in particular in foreign policy. And when you have a solid democratic country which has traditional institutions, to generate foreign policy, there is a process. And this process, at the end, produces a product. People will argue about it, but at the end, there is a product. There's a foreign policy of that state. But when the state is in a weak situation, this fragments. Now, let me use the Kurdish situation in Iraq to illustrate, to dramatically illustrate this. In our constitution, it's very clear. Foreign policy is the province of the federal government. Yet we have a regional government which engages in foreign policy of its own. It has a representative office just down the road, here. It sends delegations, it negotiates, and as Ken says, builds up a relationship with Turkey, with Iran, with the Saudis. It's acting almost as a quasi-state. This is directly against the Constitution, but there's nothing that the federal government can do about it because it is in this weak state. So I come back to the last point, which was emphasized again by John, which is for any state, and Iraq is one of them and the subject of the discussion, to generate a foreign policy that actually defends its interest. It's got to consolidate itself internally. It's got to solve its political crisis and political problems internally. It's got to build up its own institutions so that the political decisions and the policies, including the foreign policy, are generated in a manner that, although some people will disagree, but everybody can come back and rally behind. This we are certainly a long way from there, but that has to remain the target. Thank you.
John, do you want to add anything, or Ken either, and then I'll turn to the audience.
Well, I just briefly on the Kuwait issue that Greg was talking about. I take his point about where things stand, but I would just note. I still feel, particularly compared to the time when I was at the embassy in Baghdad in 2009 and 2010, Kuwait issues at that time with Iraq were just not moving forward. I remember it distinctly. And now I take Greg's point that there's still some way to go and there's still obstacles ahead. And I don't disagree with that. But I do have to say from the perspective of where we were a few years ago to where we are today, I am optimistic about the progress that Iraq and Kuwait have made so far.
Ken, do you want to add anything?
I'll just briefly second what Samir said. I think he and I are singing exactly from the same sheet of music, and I couldn't agree with him more that, again, if you read the Florentine histories, the answer to the dilemma of all of the Italian city-states is exactly what Samir said, which is you first have to get control over your own house. You've got to build a strong, cohesive government where you've got that kind of buy-in so that, and look, there are always factions. In any country, there are always factions, but so that you get to the point where the factions are not conducting independent foreign policies, reaching out to other countries or to factions in other countries to try to take action that will then influence the events in their own country. That is the dilemma of these weak states, which now dominate much of the Middle East.
Okay, we have a lot of agreement on this panel, so let's get some questions, which I didn't quite expect. I'm going to take one. I see one on this side, one in back of Barbara. Barbara, I'll get back. Was somebody had their hand? Yes, I can't see, but that person, and who was the third one, and then we'll take the second round. Tom, you want to start?
Bob Friedman, Johns Hopkins University. Question to John. Quick observation first. Same problem of weak states with Poland in the 18th century. The Russians could play off with factions and hence absorb Poland.